Lost in the Haunted Forest. True Tales of Terror. Have you ever noticed a distant sound in the forest, one that makes your heart race, but you don't have the courage to investigate? Forests have a unique way of playing with our minds, making us question what is real and what is merely fear taking shape. In this video, you'll hear terrifying accounts from people who got lost in haunted forests, where the silence is not one of peace, but of something waiting for you. These tales aren't just stories, they're real experiences lived by those who faced the unknown, fought against fear, and many of whom were never the same again. What would make you run when darkness seems to swallow everything around you? With each step in a shadowy forest, the tension rises, the air grows heavier. Could you escape a presence that stalks you in the shadows? Or will it find you first? Prepare to lose yourself in this psychological terror, where the line between reality and nightmare blurs. With each story, you'll realize that true fear doesn't lie in the creatures we see, but in those we feel, in what we cannot see yet know is there. Do you have the courage to face what lurks in the forests? Or will you let the darkness consume you? Stay until the end and find out if fear will conquer you, or if you'll be stronger than the forest's silence. Enter, but be warned. Once you hear what's here, you may never look at a forest the same way again. Story 1. The Whisper of the Lost. Ethan adjusted the strap on his camera bag, breathing in the dense, earthy air as he entered the forest. It was late afternoon, and the canopy of ancient, twisted trees filtered the last rays of sunlight into thin streams, casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. The air was thick and heavy, with a silence that made him feel as though he'd stepped into another world. Ethan was no stranger to dark places, having photographed everything from abandoned buildings to desolate mountains. But this forest, something about it felt different. The locals in town had been eager to share stories about disappearances in these woods, recounting eerie tales of people who'd entered but never returned. Some mentioned voices that could lure even the most experienced hikers off the path. He'd listened with a smirk, chalking it up to small-town superstition. The things people come up with, he muttered to himself as he adjusted his camera and checked the light fading rapidly. Ethan walked deeper, his boots crunching over leaves and twigs, the only sounds around him. He felt the forest close in, the shadows lengthening, and the air turning colder. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a faint whisper, barely perceptible. He dismissed it as the wind or his imagination playing tricks. As the sky darkened and the eerie silence thickened, Ethan couldn't shake a feeling he rarely experienced, unease. But he brushed it off, telling himself it was all just stories. The forest had grown almost unnaturally silent, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Ethan adjusted his lens, trying to capture the dim light seeping through the trees. Yet his fingers trembled slightly, a reaction he dismissed as just the chill setting in. After all, he'd spent years alone in the dark, chasing nature shots. Fear wasn't something he was familiar with. Then, the sound came again. This time it wasn't just a vague murmur. It was a whisper, low and pleading, drifting through the trees like a ghostly breeze. Ethan froze, his heart pounding as he strained to listen. "Help me." The words were faint, barely there, but unmistakable. He turned his head, searching the shadows. "Hello?" he called, but his voice felt swallowed by the dense forest. Another whisper followed, closer now, but coming from the opposite direction. "Don't leave me here." He told himself it was just the wind, maybe a bird mimicking a human voice. He pressed on, trying to focus on his work, yet his footsteps felt heavier, as if something was urging him to stop. When he glanced back, the path he'd followed seemed unfamiliar, as if the trees had shifted in place to obscure his way. Ethan felt his grip tighten around his camera. Despite his efforts to stay calm, unease was seeping into his bones. He decided it was time to head back to his tent, only to realize he wasn't sure where it was. Ethan's heartbeat quickened as he scanned the darkening forest, his breath coming faster now. Every direction looked the same. Tall, gnarled trees stretching endlessly, their branches like skeletal arms reaching out to trap him. He took a few cautious steps forward, trying to retrace his path. But the forest seemed to shift around him, as though it were a living entity bent on keeping him within its depths. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if dozens of voices were calling out to him. "Please help," one whispered. "Don't leave," another begged. Each voice sounded different, a chorus of lost souls surrounding him, and Ethan could feel panic clawing its way into his mind. He quickened his pace, each step crunching through leaves and twigs, yet the voices only seemed to follow, closing in. He tried to block them out, focusing instead on getting his bearings. But each time he thought he recognized a tree or a rock, he'd find himself looping back to the same spot, walking in maddening circles. His chest tightened, his breath shallow and fast, the forest spinning around him. Ethan's hands trembled, the weight of his camera almost forgotten. The stories he had dismissed as folklore now haunted him, each whisper becoming a terrifying reminder that he might never leave this place. He called out, hoping maybe someone would answer. "Is anyone there?" His own voice sounded small, weak, swallowed by the trees. Silence returned briefly, thick and oppressive, until the whispers rose again, louder, as if enraged by his defiance. Ethan stumbled forward, heart racing, but the whispers seemed to close in from every side. Each step made him feel more entangled, as though invisible hands were guiding him deeper into the forest. Shadows moved in his periphery, shapes flickering just out of sight, but when he turned to look, there was nothing but darkness and trees. The voices grew sharper, more desperate. "Stay with us." The words were no longer faint or gentle. They hissed directly into his ear, urgent and demanding. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, his breath ragged, forcing himself to ignore the eerie sounds. "This isn't real," he whispered to himself, but even he couldn't believe it anymore. Every whisper, every shifting shadow felt undeniably, horrifyingly real. In a surge of defiance, he shouted into the darkness, "Leave me alone!" His voice echoed for a moment, breaking the silence. For the first time, the whispers paused, as if his outburst had silenced them, just long enough to give him a false sense of victory. But then, louder than ever, they returned in unison. "Don't leave us!" Ethan's courage shattered. He dropped to his knees, clutching his head, feeling the voices push against his mind, filling his thoughts. The forest closed in tighter, the branches now appearing almost as hands, reaching out. It was as if the souls of the lost were tethered to this place, and they wouldn't allow him to escape. In the crushing silence that followed his outburst, Ethan's survival instinct kicked in. He forced himself to take a deep breath, clenching his fists until his nails dug into his palms. Slowly, he opened his eyes and noticed a faint glimmer through the trees, a narrow thread of moonlight piercing the dense canopy. Desperate for any direction, he stumbled toward it, feeling the weight of unseen eyes still pressing on him from the shadows. With every step, the whispers softened but did not vanish, trailing him like an unbreakable tether. He staggered toward the light, his feet barely finding the ground beneath him, his mind focused only on escaping. The trees seemed to part ever so slightly, enough for him to glimpse what looked like the edge of the forest in the distance. Summoning the last of his strength, Ethan pushed forward, practically running, his legs burning. He broke through the trees and fell onto a rocky path on the forest's edge, gasping for air. The whispers finally faded, leaving him in complete silence. But something felt wrong. Even in the safety of open ground, he could still feel them. Those voices, those shadows. Days later, back at home, they haunted him in every moment of silence. He would sit in his room, listening, waiting, but the forest's whispers now lived inside him, a dark presence he couldn't escape. In the dead of night, as he lay sleepless, Ethan heard it once again, faint but undeniable. "Don't leave us." Story 2. The Walk of Lament. Ryan and his younger brother Luke stood at the edge of the darkened forest, the dense trees looming like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the only sound was the soft rustle of leaves disturbed by a light breeze. Ryan, tall and broad-shouldered, adjusted the straps of his backpack. his face set in a determined expression. His eyes flicked over to Luke, who was nervously eyeing the trees, as if the shadows were alive watching them. "This is the place," Ryan said, his voice steady but not without a hint of unease. "The perfect spot to clear our heads." Luke hesitated before nodding. He had never liked the idea of this trip, but Ryan had insisted. After their parents' sudden passing 6 months ago, Ryan had taken on the role of protector, of trying to fix everything. Luke could tell it was starting to weigh on him, the responsibility. He just didn't know how to help him, or even if he could. "Yeah, it's just..." Luke trailed off, glancing nervously at the thick undergrowth. "It feels weird here, doesn't it? Like, it's too quiet." Ryan smiled faintly, trying to ease his brother's nerves. "It's just the trees. There's nothing to worry about." But as they stepped into the forest, the air grew colder, and the silence pressed in on them, thick and suffocating. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across the trail ahead. It was then that Ryan felt it, the nagging sensation that they were being watched. He shook it off as paranoia, but deep down, something in the back of his mind whispered that maybe Luke wasn't the only one unsettled by this place. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the atmosphere grew heavier. The trees pressed closer together, their branches intertwined like grasping fingers. The path they followed had been narrow at first, but it seemed to close in on them, making every step feel more deliberate, more suffocating. Ryan glanced at Luke, who was walking a few paces behind him, eyes darting from tree to tree. The young man's unease had only grown since they entered. Every now and then, Luke would mutter something to himself, as though trying to reassure himself or ward off the creeping dread that had started to creep up on him. "Did you hear that?" Luke asked suddenly, his voice shaky. Ryan paused, glancing over his shoulder. "What do you mean?" Luke swallowed hard. "It was like footsteps, like someone was following us." Ryan frowned, his eyes scanning the woods around them. But there was nothing. Just trees, no movement, no sound. He shook his head. "You're imagining things, Luke. It's probably just the wind or animals." But Luke wasn't convinced. His gaze darted back into the forest, his hand clutching the strap of his backpack as if it might anchor him to reality. "I don't think so. It's too quiet now. Like something's watching us." Ryan tried to shake off the feeling of growing discomfort, but it was hard to ignore the silence that now surrounded them. No birds, no insects, not even the wind. The forest felt unnaturally still, as if holding its breath. Ryan quickened his pace, trying to push the thoughts from his mind. Yet, despite his best efforts, something gnawed at the back of his mind. The deeper they went, the more the air seemed to thicken, as though the forest itself was closing in around them. As dusk settled over the forest, the temperature dropped sharply. The once comforting sunlight now seemed to be swallowed by the dense canopy above. The faint sounds of the forest, rustling leaves, distant birds, had all but vanished. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. Ryan set up their camp in a small clearing, the fire crackling as the last light of day slipped away. But no matter how brightly the flames burned, the feeling of unease lingered. "Do you want to eat something?" Ryan asked, glancing over his shoulder at Luke, who was sitting by the fire, staring into the dark beyond. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "I'm not hungry," Luke muttered, his voice distant. Ryan frowned, kneeling beside him. "Come on, man. It'll help. You're just tired." Luke didn't respond. Instead, he just continued to stare into the dark, as if waiting for something to appear in the shadows. After a long, tense silence, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep hearing it. The whispers." Ryan froze, his stomach tightening. "Whispers?" Luke nodded, his eyes wide with fear. "Not just that. I hear them, calling my name. They keep saying, 'Luke, come closer.'" His voice cracked with the words. Ryan tried to stay calm, but a cold shiver ran down his spine. He leaned closer to his brother, his hand resting on his shoulder. "You're just tired, Luke. It's nothing." But deep down, Ryan wasn't so sure anymore. The forest was too quiet, too still, and Luke's expression, filled with terror, did nothing to ease his growing worry. As the night wore on, the whispers grew louder. Not in the distance this time, but close. Too close. Ryan could hear them now, too. Soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from the trees themselves. A sudden rustling in the bushes broke the silence. Both brothers snapped their heads toward the sound. The forest was no longer still. Something was out there, watching. The night stretched on, and despite the fire crackling, an oppressive silence hung in the air. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of being watched hadn't. Ryan kept glancing into the trees, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Luke, on the other hand, had curled up near the fire, eyes closed, but his face twisted in a silent battle with fear. When Ryan woke the next morning, the sky was overcast and a heavy fog clung to the ground. It seemed as though the forest had grown even darker overnight. He stood up and stretched, trying to shake off the unease that had followed him since the night before. "Luke, we should keep moving," Ryan said, his voice low. But when he turned, he saw that his brother wasn't there. Panic surged through him. "Luke?" he called out, his voice echoing through the thick mist. There was no answer. He rushed into the woods, scanning for any sign of him, his heart pounding in his chest. It didn't take long to find him, though. Luke was standing in a small clearing, staring down at something on the ground. "Luke!" Ryan shouted, hurrying over. "What the hell are you doing out here? You scared the hell out of me." Luke didn't respond at first. He just stared at the object in front of him, a small, weathered journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. He picked it up carefully, as if it was something sacred, and handed it to Ryan without saying a word. Ryan flipped it open, scanning the first page. The handwriting was frantic, almost illegible in places. It told of a man named Thomas Grant, a previous traveler who had ventured into the forest years ago and had never returned. The last entry sent a chill down Ryan's spine. The whispers grow louder. They are calling me to them. I can hear my name in the trees. I am not alone. None of us are. And once you hear it, you can never escape. Ryan's blood ran cold as the words sank in. The same thing Luke had been hearing. The weight of the journal's words hung heavily between them. Ryan's hand trembled as he held the book, his mind racing with thoughts of what it all meant. He glanced at Luke, who was still staring blankly at the ground, his face as pale as the fog surrounding them. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said, his voice tight. "This forest, it's not just some place. Something's wrong." Luke didn't reply, his eyes unfocused, as if he couldn't hear him. The eerie quiet of the forest pressed in around them, and Ryan felt a gnawing sense of urgency. He turned away, muttering under his breath, "Come on, Luke, let's just get to the edge. We'll be okay." But when he looked back, Luke was gone. Ryan froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Luke?" he called out, his voice breaking. There was no answer. The silence swallowed his words whole. Panic set in. He searched frantically, his feet scrambling over roots and rocks, calling his brother's name over and over. The trees stood silent, unmoving, as if they were holding their breath. And then, just when he thought he could stand it no longer, he heard it. A soft, familiar whisper. "Ryan." It was Luke's voice, but it wasn't coming from any direction he could see. It was all around him, curling through the branches, winding around his mind. Ryan's breath caught in his throat. His brother was somewhere out there, but where? Ryan's legs burned as he pushed through the underbrush, his mind spinning with thoughts of his brother. Luke's voice was still echoing in his ears, each whisper like a thread pulling him deeper into the woods. The shadows stretched long in the dim light, and every step seemed to carry him further into an unknown terror. "Luke!" Ryan shouted, his voice raw. The forest offered no reply, only the faint rustling of leaves. His hands trembled as he stumbled into a clearing, the place where he had found the journal. The fire pit was cold now, the ash scattered and blown by the wind. He was alone. No sign of Luke, not even his footprints. But then Ryan saw it, the faint outline of something in the distance, a figure barely visible through the mist. It was moving, but not like a person. It was more like something lost, something broken, something that didn't belong to this world. He took a step forward, his breath shallow. "Luke," he whispered, but the figure didn't respond. As Ryan stepped closer, the figure began to turn. The air around him seemed to grow colder, the fog swirling faster. The whispering returned, louder now, filling his ears with voices that twisted and distorted into unintelligible cries. He reached out, his hand trembling, before realizing what he was about to do. And then, as the figure's face came into view, Ryan froze in horror. It wasn't Luke. The figure before him was a hollow version of his brother, its eyes wide with terror, its skin ashen, and from the depths of its mouth came the same whisper Ryan had heard earlier. "Ryan, come closer." The trees seemed to close in around him as the figure reached out. Ryan's heart raced, but he couldn't move, couldn't tear his eyes away from the horror that was his brother, or something that used to be. Ryan stumbled backward, his body numb with terror. The hollow version of Luke reached toward him, its twisted, lifeless hand outstretched. The voice, his brother's voice, kept calling, urging him forward, drawing him closer to the figure that now seemed to be a part of the forest itself. But Ryan couldn't move. His legs felt as if they were frozen in place, rooted to the earth. The whispers grew louder, filling his mind with memories of his parents, of the pain he had tried so desperately to bury. His guilt, his failure to protect Luke, all the emotions he had tried to suppress, swirled around him, crushing him. Then suddenly the figure vanished. The mist swirled and the silence fell like a shroud over the clearing. Ryan gasped for air, his chest heaving. The whispers had stopped, but the feeling of suffocating dread remained, thick in the air. He looked around, hoping to see his brother, to hear his voice once more. But there was nothing. The forest was still. The only sounds were the distant calls of unseen birds, the faint rustling of leaves, and the steady beat of his own heart. He turned to leave, but as he reached the edge of the clearing, he heard it once more. A soft, distant whisper, not from behind him, but from ahead. The voices were still there. Luke was still there. And the cycle of the forest, of the pain, the loss, and the whispers, would never end. Ryan's fate was sealed. The forest had claimed another soul, and soon his name would join the list of those lost within the dark, haunted woods. Story 3: The Mirror of Bones. The sun was beginning to set as the Miller family drove down the winding dirt road that led into the heart of the Hoosier National Forest. It was their first camping trip in years, and they hoped it would be a chance to reconnect. The dense trees that lined the road blocked out the last light of day, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Dan Miller, the father, gripped the steering wheel tightly, his face tense but determined. "Almost there," he said, his voice low and steady. "This is going to be a great trip." Linda Miller, his wife, glanced out the window nervously. The forest, while beautiful, had an oppressive feel to it. It wasn't like any other place they had been before. The locals had warned them, some even hinted at strange things that happened in these woods. But Dan, ever the skeptic, had brushed it off as old superstitions. "I don't know, Dan," Linda replied softly. "This place feels different. I've heard stories. Weird things happen here." Dan chuckled. "Just stories. We're going to have a blast. No more city life, no more stress." Emily, their 10-year-old daughter, leaned forward from the back seat, her eyes wide with excitement. "I can't wait to explore," she exclaimed, her voice full of anticipation. Rachel, the younger one at 7, was quieter, but her wide eyes reflected the same eagerness. She clutched her stuffed bunny tightly, looking out the window at the trees as they drove deeper into the forest. As they arrived at the campsite, a chill settled over the air. The trees seemed to stretch higher than usual, blocking out the sun even more as the family unpacked. A faint breeze rustled the leaves, and for a moment, Linda thought she heard something, like footsteps. But when she turned, there was nothing there. She shook it off, trying to push aside the unease creeping up her spine. Dan set up the tent completely unaware of her discomfort. "We'll get a campfire going soon," he said, trying to keep the mood light. "Emily, help me with the firewood." Linda watched her family with a sense of trepidation, feeling the weight of the forest press against her. Maybe Dan was right. Maybe it was just the unfamiliar surroundings. But something in the air felt off. The fire crackled as the night crept deeper into the forest, casting long, dancing shadows on the ground. The family sat around it, roasting marshmallows and laughing. But Linda couldn't shake the sense that they weren't alone. The wind had picked up, and the trees groaned under its weight, creating eerie sounds that seemed to echo through the dark. "Mum, can we go explore tomorrow?" Emily asked, her voice full of energy as she stared into the fire. Linda hesitated for a moment, glancing at Dan. He was more relaxed, enjoying the calmness of the night. "Maybe tomorrow," she replied with a smile, though her heart wasn't in it. "Let's just enjoy tonight." But the next morning, after a restless night of sleep, Emily and Rachel were eager to venture into the woods. Dan, ever the adventurer, readily agreed, and soon they were all walking along a narrow trail that cut through the thick trees. Linda hesitated but didn't want to spoil the day for her family. She followed them, her unease growing with every step. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon something unusual. Hidden deep within the trees, partially obscured by moss and branches, was a clearing. At the center of it was an altar, an ancient structure made from bone. Skulls, femurs, and rib cages formed the base, intricately arranged as though it had been carefully constructed, though time had certainly not been kind to it. The bones were weathered, bleached by the sun, and yet still unmistakably human. "Whoa," Emily whispered, her voice awestruck as she stepped forward. She reached out to touch one of the bones but was stopped by Linda. "Don't touch anything, Emily," Linda warned, her voice tight. "We don't know what this is." Dan, too, seemed uneasy but tried to brush it off. "Just some old remnants from the past," he muttered, though his gaze lingered on the altar longer than necessary. Rachel, meanwhile, had wandered closer to the altar's center, where a large, weathered mirror stood. The frame was covered in strange symbols, etched deep into the wood. Dust coated its surface, but there was something unsettling about it. Something about the way it reflected the forest around them. It didn't feel right. "Look," Emily gasped, pointing at the mirror. At first it seemed like a normal reflection, but then the image began to shift. The trees in the reflection seemed darker, more twisted, and in the center of the frame there was a figure, a woman, staring back at them. Her features were indistinct, her face blurred, but her eyes were unnaturally bright, glowing with an eerie light. "Who is that?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. Linda felt a chill run down her spine. "We need to go back, now." Dan turned, ready to argue, but when he looked into the mirror, his words caught in his throat. The figure in the reflection seemed to move slightly, as if it had noticed them too. Dan's unease deepened. "All right, let's go," he said, his voice more tense than before. "It's just a weird old thing. Nothing more." But even as they turned to leave, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone anymore. As night fell again, the atmosphere around the campsite grew heavier. The sky, once a soft shade of orange, now appeared to be a deep, oppressive blue, with the clouds swirling in unnatural patterns. The air was still, except for the occasional rustling of leaves, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Linda couldn't help but glance nervously at the trees surrounding them, feeling a presence in the shadows that made her skin crawl. The fire crackled, casting long, jagged shadows across the tent and the area around it. "Mom, I'm going to use the bathroom," Rachel said quietly, her small voice breaking through Linda's thoughts. Linda looked up from the fire, startled. It had been a long day of hiking and exploring, and both girls were exhausted. "It's getting late, sweetie. Can't it wait?" Rachel shook her head. "I'll be quick," she said with a determined look. "I'll just be right back." Before Linda could protest, Rachel slipped into the darkness, her small figure quickly disappearing into the trees. Linda watched her go, feeling a sudden pang of unease. The forest, so quiet before, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. "Don't worry," Dan said. his voice calm but distracted as he poked at the fire. "She's just going for a quick walk. Nothing's going to happen." Linda nodded, trying to convince herself, but the uneasy feeling in her chest refused to fade. She shifted in her seat, glancing over at Emily, who was silently watching the flames. She was lost in her own thoughts, her face pale and quiet, far removed from the energetic child Linda was used to. Minutes passed, then 10, then 20. Still no sign of Rachel. "Dan," Linda said, her voice tight. "Where's Rachel?" He looked up, startled. "She's just taking her time, Linda. She'll be back." But as the minutes stretched into an agonizing half-hour, worry began to crawl its way up Linda's spine. "I'm going to look for her," she said, her voice firm. "I'll come with you," Emily said quickly, standing up and grabbing her flashlight. Dan, reluctant to admit his own growing anxiety, nodded. The three of them stepped into the trees, the darkness thick around them. Linda's heart pounded as she called Rachel's name, her voice cutting through the silence. "Rachel! Rachel!" There was no answer, only the sound of their footsteps on the forest floor, soft and muffled. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the temperature seemed to drop and a heavy fog began to creep in. Linda shivered, clutching her jacket tighter, her breath coming in short bursts. The air felt wrong. The trees towered over them, their twisted branches like gnarled fingers reaching down, threatening to grab them. "Mom! Dad!" Emily called out, her voice trembling. "I think I see her." Linda spun around, her heart leaping in her chest. Emily was standing in the direction of a dense thicket, pointing with wide eyes. Linda rushed toward her, relief flooding through her veins. But as they neared, her heart dropped. The only thing in front of them was the broken reflection of the trees in the mirror, just like the one they had seen earlier. The mirror was standing alone in the clearing, untouched by time, the symbols on its frame now glowing faintly. Linda's breath caught in her throat as she saw Rachel's face in the reflection. Her small, innocent face was smiling, twisted and wrong, her eyes empty and void of life. Before Linda could react, the figure in the mirror seemed to move. Rachel's image raised a hand, pointing towards the deep shadows of the forest, as though urging them to follow. "Rachel!" Linda screamed, but the reflection did not respond. It only grew darker, the woman's eyes in the mirror now gleaming brighter, as if drawing something closer from the depths of the forest. Panic surged through Linda. "Dan!" she shouted, but her voice felt distant, swallowed by the night. Dan appeared beside her, his face pale. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice strained. Linda's eyes frantically searched the clearing, the mirror now reflecting only the dark, dense forest. It was as if Rachel had been swallowed whole by the shadows themselves. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "She's gone." They searched through the forest for hours, calling Rachel's name, but there was no sign of her. Not a footprint, not a whisper. It was as if the forest itself had taken her, swallowed her whole into its darkness. When they returned to the campsite, the fog was thicker, and the campfire had almost burned out. The sense of wrongness was unbearable now, as if something had followed them back from the woods. Dan, his face drawn and hollow, took Linda's hand. He didn't say anything, but his eyes, those tired, terrified eyes, spoke louder than any words could. And deep within the forest, the sound of distant, faint laughter echoed, carried by the wind. The night was long, and even though they had returned to the campsite, the weight of Rachel's disappearance clung to them like a second skin. Linda sat up in the dark, staring into the dying embers of the campfire. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions, but the most pressing one was the same. Where is Rachel? Dan sat beside her, his face drained of color. "We can't just give up," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. He was struggling to hold on to the belief that Rachel could still be out there, somewhere. "We'll find her. We have to." Linda didn't respond immediately, lost in the fog of fear and disbelief. The forest outside the firelight seemed alive, a vast and silent expanse of shadow, watching, waiting. Linda felt like they were not in control here, like something else was pulling the strings. "I need to know more about this place," she said finally, her voice steady but thick with exhaustion. "There has to be something in the history of this forest, something we're missing." Dan nodded, though he wasn't sure what good that would do. "We'll figure it out tomorrow." The next day, after a restless night, they decided to hike into town to see if they could find any answers. The small local library, tucked away on a side street, was the only place they could think of that might hold any information about the forest's dark past. Inside, the librarian, a woman in her 50s named Mrs. Barnes, watched them curiously as they explained their situation. She didn't seem surprised. Instead, she led them to a back room filled with old maps, faded newspapers, and dusty books. "I knew you'd come," she said softly, almost as if she had been expecting them. "You're not the first to search for answers. This forest has a long history of strange happenings." Linda sat down at a table piled high with papers, her fingers trembling as she flipped through them. There were mentions of disappearances, dozens of them, stretching back centuries. But there was one entry that caught her eye, a newspaper clipping from the early 1800s. The headline read, "Cults' Dark Rituals Unveiled, Forest Now a Forbidden Place." The article described a group of settlers who had arrived in the area, only to discover that the land was already inhabited by an ancient cult that had been performing dark rituals for centuries. The cult used the forest as a site for human sacrifices, binding souls to mirrors that acted as gateways to another world, a world of shadows and lost souls. Linda's blood ran cold as she read the rest. The cult's final ritual was said to have been a great sacrifice to the Mirror of Bones, a cursed object that had absorbed the souls of its victims. The last line sent a shiver down her spine. "Beware the forest, for the mirrors reflect not what is, but what could be. They say it's the forest itself." Mrs. Barnes spoke up from behind them, her voice low. "The souls of those sacrificed are trapped, wandering forever in the trees. Some say the forest calls for new souls, to take the place of those who've vanished." Dan looked at Linda, his face paling. "Are you telling me that Rachel—" "I'm telling you that the forest has a life of its own," Mrs. Barnes continued. "And once you see the mirror, you can't unsee it. The souls, they reach for you." Linda's heart raced, the reality of their situation setting in. They were no longer just searching for Rachel, they were searching for a way out. The weight of Mrs. Barnes's words lingered in the air as Linda and Dan walked back to the campsite. The library was quiet now, the sun sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally along the ground. Linda's mind raced, her thoughts clouded by the history they had just uncovered. The Mirror of Bones. Was it the same mirror they had seen in the forest? Was that where Rachel had disappeared to? "We need to go back," Linda said, her voice resolute, but filled with a quiet fear. "We have to find it. We have to find that mirror and get Rachel back." Dan hesitated, then nodded. He didn't believe in superstitions, but what they had encountered the night before could not be explained by logic. His daughter was gone, and the only thing that made any sense now was the idea that the mirror had something to do with it. As they approached the forest again, the trees seemed even more foreboding than before. The mist from the night before had returned, swirling around their feet like ghostly hands trying to pull them deeper into the woods. The closer they got to the clearing, the colder it became. The silence was deafening, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves in the wind, which now felt unnatural, as though something was watching them. The clearing where the mirror had stood was just ahead, and Linda's heart pounded in her chest. She could feel the pull of something beyond her comprehension, something ancient and powerful. It was as if the forest itself was alive, breathing, and it was waiting for them to enter. "Stay close," Dan murmured, his voice tight with anxiety. "We don't know what we're dealing with here." The mirror was still there, standing upright in the middle of the clearing. It seemed unchanged, though the surrounding forest had grown darker, more oppressive. The symbols on its frame now pulsed with an eerie, faint light, like a heartbeat. Linda's breath hitched. She could see Rachel's reflection once again, her small face peering back at them from the glass. But this time, Rachel's expression was different, no longer twisted and unnatural. She looked lost, confused, almost as if she were calling out for them. "Rachel!" Linda shouted, stepping forward. Dan grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "No, don't get too close." But it was too late. Linda's eyes were locked on the mirror, on Rachel's reflection. She felt a sudden tug, as if something in the mirror was pulling her in, drawing her toward it. The reflection of Rachel seemed to smile, an empty, sad smile, as if to beckon them. But there was no warmth in it, only a chilling, hollow emptiness. "We need to break it," Dan yelled, his voice sharp with panic. "We need to destroy it." Linda nodded, snapping out of her trance. "How?" The ground beneath them began to shake slightly, as though the earth itself was reacting to their presence. The mirror's glow intensified, the symbols flashing rapidly, and a low hum filled the air. The forest seemed to exhale a collective sigh, and Linda felt a terrible presence, an overwhelming sense of dread that threatened to suffocate her. "We have to find a way to destroy it," Linda whispered, her voice trembling. "We have to end this before it takes everything." Dan stepped forward cautiously, brandishing a heavy branch like a weapon. He swung it at the mirror, but when the branch made contact, there was no shattering of glass. Instead, the mirror seemed to absorb the blow, the surface rippling like water. And then suddenly, the ground trembled harder, and a shriek, high-pitched and terrible, echoed through the trees. It was a sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. The trees groaned and bent as though they were alive, and Linda could feel something shifting beneath the surface of the earth, a dark force awakening. "We need to leave," Dan said urgently, pulling Linda back. But it was too late. A shadow loomed over them from the forest, and in the mirror, something began to emerge, something dark and vast. The figure from the reflection, the woman with glowing eyes, stepped out of the glass. Her form was tall and impossibly thin, her features sharp and jagged, like she had been pulled from the very shadows of the forest. Her eyes burned with an unnatural light, and her mouth stretched into a cruel grin as she looked at them. Linda felt her heart stop. The woman was here. The figure that emerged from the mirror was like nothing Linda had ever seen. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The woman stood tall, her body unnaturally thin, as though she were more shadow than flesh. Her face was long, with hollow eyes that glowed a sickly green, and her mouth stretched into a grin that sent shivers down Linda's spine. The woman's hands, long and spindly, reached forward as if she were beckoning them closer. Linda instinctively stepped back, pulling Dan with her. What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Dan couldn't answer. His face had gone pale, and he seemed rooted to the spot, unable to move as the woman took a slow, deliberate step toward them. The forest around them felt alive, twisting, moving, as if it were a part of the creature itself. The trees bent low, their branches creaking, as if they were surrendering to the darkness that had come alive within the clearing. "Rachel," Linda gasped, her voice cracking. "Is she—" The woman's eyes flickered toward Linda, and she let out a low, rasping laugh. "She's with me now," the figure rasped, her voice hollow and echoing, as if it were coming from all around them at once. "Your daughter has crossed into my world. The forest is mine, and now so is she." Dan reached for the branch again, but it was as if the air itself had thickened, making it impossible to move. Linda's heart raced, the weight of the situation crashing over her. The woman had spoken the truth. Rachel was gone. But how? And what had happened to her? "Take her back," Linda screamed, stepping forward in desperation. "We'll do anything, just give her back." The woman tilted her head, the sickly green glow of her eyes flashing brighter. "Anything," she crooned. "You do not understand, little mortal. Your daughter is mine now. The forest has claimed her soul." The ground beneath them trembled again, and the woman's figure seemed to flicker, distorting like a mirage in the heat. The air grew heavier, and Linda felt her legs weaken, as though the very earth was trying to pull her down. It was as if they were no longer standing on solid ground, but sinking into something far darker. Suddenly, the woman stretched out her hand toward the mirror, and Linda could hear Rachel's voice, soft and distant, whispering from the other side. "Mom, Dad, help me," Linda gasped, her breath catching in her throat. That was Rachel's voice, but it didn't sound like Rachel anymore. It sounded like a ghost, a faint echo of the child she once knew, trapped somewhere far away. "We have to do something," Dan cried, shaking off his paralysis. He rushed forward, slamming his hands against the mirror's surface in a desperate attempt to reach Rachel. But it was no use. The mirror pulsed with an energy that pushed him back, sending him stumbling to the ground. The woman in the clearing laughed again, the sound more shrill this time, like the wind scraping against bones. She took another step forward, her face now close enough for Linda to feel the cold, suffocating presence of her. "You cannot save her," the woman whispered, her breath like ice against Linda's skin. "She is mine, bound forever to this forest, just as you will be." Linda's heart pounded in her chest. The woman's words were like daggers, cold and sharp, sinking into her soul. But there was a flicker of hope, a momentary thought. She remembered the stories Mrs. Barnes had told them at the library, the mention of the cult and their twisted rituals. What if the mirror could be destroyed? What if there was a way to break the curse? The woman's form began to fade, slipping back toward the mirror, as though the darkness itself was reclaiming her. "You are too late," she hissed. "This is the price you must pay." Linda's mind raced. The mirror. It had to be the key. If they could destroy it, if they could break whatever connection held Rachel's soul in this twisted world, they might still have a chance. Dan, breathing heavily and eyes wide with fear, met her gaze. "Linda, I don't know what to do." The woman's cold laughter filled the clearing again, louder now, as the mirror began to tremble. The ground beneath them buckled and shifted, but Linda's resolve hardened. "This isn't over. We can't lose Rachel. Not like this." Without thinking, Linda lunged toward the mirror, ignoring the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped her chest. She reached for the frame, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface. The symbols etched in the wood pulsed under her touch, glowing brighter. "I won't let you take her," she muttered, almost to herself. Linda's hand trembled as it hovered over the glowing symbols on the mirror's frame. The air around her seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She could hear the woman's voice, distorted and shrill, echoing from all directions. "You cannot stop me. You cannot save her. She is mine, and you are too weak to break the bond." The weight of her words was like a physical force, but Linda clenched her teeth and steeled herself. She wouldn't give up on Rachel. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. With a deep breath, Linda grabbed the mirror's frame, feeling the coldness of it seep into her skin. She pushed harder, pressing her palm against the symbols, hoping that anything would give. The glow from the mirror pulsed brighter, almost blinding her, and the ground beneath her feet began to quake, as though the forest itself was recoiling from her touch. The woman's form flickered again, her ghostly face twisting into a grotesque sneer. "You cannot break what has already been bound. The mirror is eternal." But Linda refused to listen. She recalled what Mrs. Barnes had said. The mirror was a gateway, a prison that held the lost souls of the cult's victims. If they were to survive, they had to destroy it. There was no other choice. "Dan," Linda called out, her voice urgent. "Help me." Dan, his face pale and eyes wide with fear, stepped forward slowly, his hands shaking as he reached for the nearest object, a large rock, jagged and heavy. He swung it with all his strength, aiming for the edge of the mirror. The impact was deafening, the sound echoed through the clearing, and for a brief moment Linda thought it had worked. But the mirror remained intact, undisturbed. "Again!" Linda shouted, desperation lacing her words. "Hit it again!" Dan swung the rock again, harder this time. The mirror trembled, the symbols glowing brighter, the hum growing louder until it felt like the entire forest was vibrating. For a moment, Linda feared the forest itself would tear apart. But then, something changed. With a loud, sharp crack, the surface of the mirror shattered. The woman's form screamed in rage, her face contorting in fury as shards of glass exploded outward, scattering into the air. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the woman let out a deafening wail that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the forest. Linda stumbled back, shielding her face from the flying shards. As the dust settled, she could hear Rachel's voice again, faint and distant, but closer now. "Mom, Dad, please." Linda's heart leaped in her chest. Rachel, the voice was real, clear and full of anguish, but it wasn't coming from the mirror anymore. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the forest, from beyond the clearing. Without hesitation, Linda grabbed Dan's arm. "We have to go. She's out there. We have to find her." Dan didn't argue. He nodded quickly, his face a mixture of fear and determination, and the two of them began to run toward the source of Rachel's voice. The forest around them seemed to shift, the shadows growing darker and more oppressive with every step. The trees seemed to close in on them, as if trying to trap them inside the labyrinth of twisted branches. But Linda didn't stop. She couldn't, not when Rachel was so close. The forest seemed alive around them, every step Linda and Dan took echoing in the eerie silence. The trees towered overhead, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the light, leaving them in perpetual twilight. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to make their next move. Linda's heart pounded in her chest, and every part of her screamed at her to hurry. She could hear Rachel's voice again, more clearly now, calling out to her. Soft, fragile, but unmistakable. "Mom, Dad, I'm scared." The sound was coming from deeper within the forest, somewhere in the direction of the ruins of an old stone building that Linda hadn't noticed before. The structure seemed ancient, its stone walls crumbling and overgrown with vines. It was as if it had been there for centuries, forgotten by time, hidden in the depths of the forest. Linda turned to Dan, her breath quickening. "She's here. I know it. We have to go inside." Dan nodded, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes scanning the trees as if expecting something to leap from the shadows. But Linda didn't wait. She moved toward the ruins, Dan following closely behind. As they reached the entrance, Linda hesitated for just a moment. The silence here was unnerving, oppressive. She could feel the presence of something dark, ancient and malevolent, watching them from the shadows. Inside, the air was colder, and the walls of the structure seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. The ruins felt like a tomb, and Linda's breath caught in her throat as she saw it. A large stone altar at the center of the room. And on the altar, in the faint light, lay Rachel. The girl was still, her eyes closed, her face pale, but she was alive. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, and beside her, standing in the shadows, was the woman. The figure from the mirror had returned, now fully corporeal, her form standing tall and imposing by the altar. She looked even more monstrous than before, her eyes glowing a fierce, unholy green. "You're too late," the woman hissed. "She is already mine." Linda rushed forward, her heart in her throat. "Rachel," she cried, her voice breaking. "Wake up. You have to wake up." The woman raised her hands, and a dark energy began to swirl around the room. The stone walls groaned as if they were alive, and the air crackled with malevolent force. Linda's entire body seemed to vibrate with the power in the room, and a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. The woman was stronger than before, feeding off the energy of the altar, feeding off Rachel's soul. Dan stepped forward, his voice firm despite the terror that gripped him. "We won't let you have her. You've already taken enough." The woman turned toward him, her smile widening, exposing sharp, jagged teeth. "You cannot stop me. The forest belongs to me now, and your daughter is mine, just as you will be once you are gone." But Linda wouldn't back down. She ran toward Rachel, her mind focused on one thing, saving her daughter. With every step, the power of the room seemed to push against her. But Linda didn't stop. She reached the altar and gently cradled Rachel's head in her hands. Rachel's eyes fluttered open and her lips parted, a faint whisper escaping. "Mom, Dad." Linda's heart broke, but she held her daughter close, her voice shaking. "I'm here, Rachel. We're getting you out of here. You're not staying with her." With all her strength, Linda pulled Rachel off the altar, and the moment their bodies made contact, a brilliant, blinding light filled the room. The woman screeched, her form flickering violently as if being torn apart by the light. The walls of the room cracked, and the air hummed with a terrible high-pitched sound. The shadows began to retreat, the dark energy dissipating into nothingness. The woman screamed, the sound of her rage echoing through the ruins. "You cannot escape. You cannot—" Before she could finish, the room exploded in a burst of light so intense that Linda had to shield her eyes. When the light finally faded, the ruins were empty. The altar was gone, and the forest had returned to its still, silent state. Linda blinked, disoriented, and looked down at Rachel. Her daughter was in her arms, breathing normally now, her eyes wide with confusion but no longer clouded with fear. The sinister presence that had once hung over them was gone. The woman was gone. And for the first time since they had entered the forest, Linda felt a sense of peace. "We're safe," Linda whispered, her voice trembling with relief. Dan, who had been standing in stunned silence, finally stepped forward, his eyes glistening. "We did it. We really did it." Rachel stirred in Linda's arms, her voice small but clear. "Mom, Dad, what happened?" Linda smiled, holding her daughter tight. "We're going home, sweetheart. We're going home." The forest, once dark and oppressive, now seemed like just a forest. The mist had lifted, and the trees no longer felt like they were watching them. As they made their way out of the ruins and back toward the campsite, Linda knew they had escaped the clutches of something ancient and powerful. They had broken the curse. They had survived, and Rachel was free.